I've been asked today to talk a little bit about replanting and planting natural areas. In the Midwest and East Coast, emerald ash borer really affected riparian areas a lot, and that this was really overshadowed by what happened in the urban areas. And so we haven't heard as much about it. I think maybe the sort of riparian ecologists and people who work in these areas aren't as sort of internationally or nationally connected as we are in urban forestry. And so in thinking about how emerald ash borer is going to affect Oregon, I believe we think that the urban area is not going to overshadow the riparian area, that we're strongly in Oregon going to feel the impacts of this insect going through these riparian and natural sort of areas. And so in thinking through this, we really want to try to make a couple of assumptions or lay out our expectations. So I expect emerald ash borer to move across Oregon and spread into Washington and California. I expect in riparian areas for us to not do a lot of management. Hopefully, we find some ways to do some good management, but overall, we're probably not going to be treating millions of trees with insecticides. We're probably not going to be preemptively removing millions of riparian ash trees. They're probably going to die and stand in place. Our land managers are probably going to struggle with what to do with all of these standing dead trees, likely invasive species spread in the understory underneath these, and all sorts of problems associated with that. Another big difference between the Midwest and the West Coast is our threatened and endangered salmon populations and how important that is to us. So use of insecticides in our riparian areas potentially is going to have some aquatic food web impacts that we're going to be paying close attention to. So largely, I think that these areas are going to go unmanaged, and we'll see how much management we can do sort of in between all of that. So rather than trying to replicate what is lost, one potential approach that we're going to consider is to view this as an opportunity to re-envision our entire site. We're going to say, hey, rather than trying to just one-for-one replace, let's try to think about this whole site and how it could be different and what we might do about that. And Rob's going to talk about that. And before I pass it off, I'm just going to mention what else we're going to talk about here in our few minutes before we dive into the main part, which is you all asking questions. So I hope you all have questions here. If anyone is here to say, hey, we're going to take Fraxinus latifolia and we're going to cross it off our list and replace it with one other species, you will not be hearing that from any of us, right? And so Mike is going to go through more of a hydrological approach that's very site-specific and thinking about how we might actually go about starting to do this. And then ultimately, us humans are not going to be the judges of the success in these riparian areas. Our salmon, our water temperatures, and our wildlife are going to judge our successes. And so Joan is going to talk a little bit about birds, maybe birds being bioindicators for health, and what can we expect this to happen and what can we do to better help them.
When we talk about invasive species, they are multi-jurisdictional problems, and they don't pay attention to whether they're in an urban space or a rural space. So as we manage emerald ash borer and the after effects and the current effects, that will be a decision for both areas to consider in conjunction and in coordination. So just real quick, putting that out there. So what I want to do is I want to give you just 3 big points, and I'm not going to focus on replacing ash. I'm sorry to my friend Brian here. Jim went to me and said, hey, talk about how to replace the ash. And I'm like, well, it's more complicated. And so what I want to say is it's not about replacing the ash. It's about thinking about the ecology of the site rather than the trees themselves. So let's talk about the forest, not just the trees. So the first thing I want to say is, first, we have to remember that the forests are made up of multiple tree species or single tree species. You have groves, you have landscapes, you have interconnected matrices of life, if you will, and they are not necessarily just a monotypic thing. You can't just plug one Lego in to replace another Lego in a forest. So looking at this riparian area, for example, it's a drier habitat, it has a different kind of soil, it has a whole bunch of variety of environmental factors influencing it, and ash are a component of that system. They are not just the system. So we can't just plug and play the way you could in a street tree, for example. And so think about that. The second thing to think about are systems are dynamic and changing. They're always undergoing change. And like it or not, we intellectually understand this, but we may struggle with our lifetime perspective, which is short and sweet compared to that of a tree or a landscape, in that we don't see environmental change very quickly. So oftentimes we think in terms of ecological change because we're trained that way, but it's hard to see. We're going to see it. So we're going to see it come really fast. It's going to change a lot of things, and we're going to have to figure out how to adapt to it. But the fact is that these ecosystems in Oregon in particular have been changing for a long, long, long time, since time immemorial, and they have particularly been accelerating in their change since humans arrived here a few thousand years ago and started altering those ecosystems with things like fire and changes in fauna, changes in climate, and ultimately things like development and agriculture and logging, for example, forestry. So you cannot ignore the pace of change that does occur in a human's lifetime or outside of a human's lifetime. I want to point out here, this is an iconic stand of ash, monotypic ash, in an almost reference condition forested wetland. This is one of those Oregon conservation strategy ecosystem habitat types that is absolutely considered a critical and rare ecosystem, according to ODFW, for example. This is in the Tualatin Hills Nature Parks. These ecosystems, though, have not always been this way, and they won't always stay this way. Let's look at the next possible alternative to that, which is a shrub wetland. It's a very different ecosystem, but it has ash in it. It had ash in it. It may have developed from there to there over time because things change with hydrology, soils, climate, for example. So we cannot assume that it changing to this is an undesirable condition, or even if we went all the way back to an emergent marsh, which we could possibly have if a beaver had moved into this ecosystem just tomorrow. So think about the fact that these ecosystems are going to change, and when we talk about seral stages or transitions, states and transitions, if you're into that kind of model, forests and wetlands, for example, are always cycling through between wet prairie, emergent marsh, shrub wetland, and forested wetland. This will be the hardest one to replace right now, and it'll be the biggest impact we feel because of all the monotypic ash and the large caliper ash in it. But the fact is that these are equally desirable ecosystems, and in some cases they're even rarer now because of patterns of environmental change. And if you look at sort of the patterns of environmental change that occur in wetland ecosystems, you can see cycles of change between wet prairie, emergent marsh, forested wetland, and shrub wetland, oftentimes driven by ecosystem engineers like beavers. We may have to consider that the emerald ash borer is yet another ecosystem engineer. It's not doing something we desire, but it is engineering things for us. Also consider that the pace of environmental change has been accelerated by human beings, and it's going very, very quickly. This is a 1850s map written by John Christie, created by a whole team of folks who looked through 1850 era survey maps and put together a beautiful rendition of the Willamette Valley 150, 170 years ago now. And you won't be able to pick out ash in this, but you can say that none of these ecosystems are exactly like that nowadays, are they? So we have to recognize that some of these ecosystems with ash as the dominant overstory have been altered. They have been changed by example drainage patterns, drain tiles, the creation of berms, the creation of off-channel cutoffs. They've been changed by burning. They've been changed by logging and forestry practices, or obliterated by development, for example. So we cannot consider that these systems are static. We're just about to go through a lot of change. So I'm trying to give you that context to consider. And lastly, our ecosystem engineers are out there busy altering these habitats all of the time. We in the Tualatin Basin, where we are the epicenter, experience this regularly with our friends, the beavers. I just want to leave you with a more complex picture rather than just focusing on that one, what do I do to replace this one ash? It's not like the scene in The Jerk where he's talking about, I just need this one chair, just this one chair, this one thermos. No, it's not about that one ash. It's about that one ecosystem and that bigger, more complicated landscape and longer time period.
I manage riparian restoration sites. A lot of the places that I manage and where ash is, so this is kind of a, cartoony diagram of the Tualatin Basin, and it could fill in for a lot of the Willamette Valley. And so a lot of times people say, oh, the ash are down in the wet areas, and there's so much variation when you talk about the wet areas or the riparian areas that I'm kind of have to deal with and I'm really attuned to. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not talking about those higher elevation areas, the kind of iconic, if you can see the bottom of the stream and there's rocks in it, I'm not really that worried about, the loss of ash in that place, because generally they're a minor component of that type of riparian forest. So more in this kind of tannish area with these, agricultural and urban lower gradient streams, it's kind of more where I'm focused. And I'm specifically concerned about the riparian forests because they provide this, very definitive ecological function that we're poised to lose a lot of. And there's also a lot more riparian forests than there are these iconic monotypic ash forested wetlands. Those are very great, but ash are a huge component of our riparian forests. And I'm also going to say that the good thing about this is that while they are a huge part of our riparian forest, is that there's more options in a riparian forest for replacement species. This is I could say this is anywhere in the Willamette Valley of a low gradient stream. This happens to be the Tualatin Valley. So just keeping in mind that proximity to surface water doesn't mean that you have a wet site. Proximity to surface water during the summer does mean that your site has the ability to have outsized cascading positive effects on the ecology by maintaining, colder water temperatures. So looking at this thing, I kind of circled some places that I think are wetter, and they're actually far off the channel. Obviously in the channel and, below the, ordinary high water is almost every part of this picture other than where you might see a building, honestly. But you see these lines of conifers that are right along the riparian area that are, capable of providing a lot of shade. And that's actually what I would call maybe a more mesic riparian forest along there. These blue areas are kind of some off-channel wetlands. And sometimes these smaller streams, if they haven't been ditched or incised, there's actually a lot better groundwater connection, and they can be they can actually be a lot wetter. So this kind of fatter circle that I've got down in the bottom is kind of indicative of that versus some of the more straighter ditches that are drier. So this is actually the Tualatin River, but moving it down to one of the tributaries of that, now we're looking at Dairy Creek. And as Dairy Creek is kind of moving down this way, you're kind of looking at the creek this way. So this picture over here is this ash forested wetland that's back here. And I've seen this pattern over and over again. So you've got the higher, drier ground right here, which is, I'm calling this the mesic to wet riparian forest transition. And it's moving away from the channel. Your hydric soils are back here away from the channel. So ash will be lost back here, and you have less options for what you can do to manage that. You can see in the picture canary grass, skunk cabbage. You can also see some other replacement tree species in there, but if you actually walk back in there, they're growing on these little microsites. So they're actually slightly higher than where the ash are growing. What I'm calling the larger perennial streams, I would argue that there's actually a lot of replacement species options, and I'll get into that later, pulling from the OSU extension article. Smaller perennial streams, if it's 5 feet wide, this canopy is almost, wholly ash trees right here. There's some shrubs in the understory, and then you've got your other ecosystem engineer, the reed canary grass down here. But this is not a lost cause here either, because some of these there's shorter species like, the Pacific willow, the red osier dogwood, there's all these kind of shrub habitats that if you're interested in maintaining shade on that creek, they're going to do a pretty, worthwhile job, I think, just because the streams aren't that big. Once the streams get big, they've got that natural levee, and then there's those mesic conditions in the near riparian area. Sometimes it's natural, sometimes it's a levee that was pushed up by somebody for farming and draining purposes a long time ago. So what about ash forested wetlands? I think this is what a lot of us have in mind when we're thinking about ash, and I don't have any good solutions here. I mean, other than thinking about, do you need to replace the canopy? And then maybe I would just put a plug that if people are going around thinking that, every one of these little municipalities that has their little postage stamp ash forested wetland, maybe we could coordinate a little bit more so we preserve some of the better, more intact ones, instead of, every little municipality trying to maintain their own slice of biodiversity through, if they were to do insecticide treatments or something like that. Okay, this is probably the meat of this, something that you can take away from this presentation. This is an OSU extension publication that came out in the past few months. Credit George Kroll and Dave Shaw. There's the little number in the bottom, and I think that we'll get into talking about this later. It's got a wet to dry transition on it. It also talks about clay intolerant and clay intolerant. And then I kind of put these boxes on here to kind of differentiate between ash forested wetland and riparian forest, kind of where that gradient is. So one of the things with this is that this graphic, it talks about if you're trying to look at your individual site and think about what's appropriate, you probably don't have many of these species on there that you can, look to, especially like how many natural Willamette Valley ponderosa pines on there. So how do you get a good indication of how wet your site is? And a lot of this gets into things that, revegetation, restoration ecologists go through all the time, but these, replacement species might not be there to kind of guide you. It's like, oh, this one's doing well than this other one. So you need to come up with other common indicator species that you can place on that gradient, things that you're going to see, but also tell you something. So canary grass, blackberry, most sites are going to have that. Snowberry, if you want a native shrub example. You can also look to see, what kind of soil is it from NRCS's web soil survey if you're not used to using that. If it's a hydric soil, you're going to be more in those ash forested wetland areas. In my area, it's Cove and Wapato. It means it's a wetland. If it's called something like Chehalis silty clay loam is a very common one, that would mean kind of this mesic riparian fringe. But there's some other tools that you can use to kind of try to place your site on this graphic. But this graphic is part of a write-up, and I would direct you guys to that too. Okay, so when you think about choosing resilient alternatives, I think that I'm getting to where when it comes to providing shade over, through riparian forests, there's kind of a similar mentality, at least in my own mind, about diversifying the canopy portfolio, taken from the kind of the urban forest mentality of, you don't want to have more than 10% of anything. So the answer is definitely not replace ash with oak everywhere, especially since there's a new pest. There's going to continue to be new pests, and you want to continue to be broadly invested in what your canopy is that you're counting on to provide shade and other ecological functions. This figure from Kroll and Shaw also points out which ones might not be well suited to climate change based on where their ranges are and how poorly they've already shown to be doing. And sorry for the chili peppers, I'm not a PowerPoint pro, but it says on there they're declining. So you got black hawthorn, red alder, grand fir, and western red cedar. So a lot of times when I talk to people that are, oh, it's a wet spot, the answer is to a lot of people that are used to forestry and tree planting is western red cedar, because that's what they know, and we're very tied in using conifers, but it was not where I would be thinking about going. So we've got all these invasive pests that are coming in, and we can't do anything to keep them out, but we're going to like harangue ourselves about bringing up something that might have some benefit to help maintain, diverse function. And I guess that's my roundabout way of getting to assisted migration. So I put 3 candidates up here that I think could also be potential alternatives that I don't really know where they fall into this wet, dry, and clay tolerance diagram here, but these are ones that, myself and with Tualatin SWCD and Clean Water Services, we're going to be evaluating these. We're collecting seed in areas identified using the seed lot selection tool, and we're going to grow them out in the Tualatin Valley along with a bunch of other species. So I feel like the time is here to think about this, and it's not always just about bringing up new species. It's about, genetics and a lot more nuance than that, but I kind of want to diversify a little bit more. And then another thing when you're looking at this diagram is just think about what is shade tolerant, because there's going to be times where you're going to need to, get that next successional phase going, and we're not going to be going in and removing all of these trees and clearing up, and creating sunlight and new resources. There's going to be underplanting, and it's not like you're either shade tolerant or shade intolerant. It's a spectrum. So just paying really close attention to that, and there's opportunities to plant species that need sun that you can plant in pretty full shade, and they can be hanging out there waiting for those resources to arrive. So. And not even going to get into like some potential silvicultural options, but anyways, I think that's what I've got, but definitely recommend this publication. I think that's the 3rd time I mentioned that. So if you get nothing else from this.
When I was told to talk about ash substitutes for wildlife, I first wanted to think about, well, what does ash provide for wildlife? And I looked through the literature, and what I found was there's not a lot of information. And from what I could tell, there are no wildlife species that are like uniquely associated with ash very strongly. And I'm a bird person mostly, and I asked all my fellow birders, it's like, what do you know about, if you go to ash groves, what do you want to see? What are you going there for? And they're like, So, and then this morning's talk by Anthony kind of confirmed that, because a lot of birds are insectivores, and what he said is there's not a lot of insects on ash. So that was interesting to me. So not a lot known. So I took a functional approach thinking about this. What do the birds and wildlife need? They need food and they need cover. And a lot of the birds associated with deciduous trees here are insectivores, so they're looking for insects to eat. And that's one of the main things. The foliage supports insect prey for birds and bats. Let's not forget about the bats. And then when ash get to be large diameter, they can have nice cavities for nesting. So they're good for that. The seeds are eaten by some species, like western gray squirrel, and branches provide nesting structure. One of the main things, I just added this last point today because I just thought about it. I was thinking tree level, but at the landscape level, and this could be the most important thing about ash, is it connects the landscape through riparian corridors. And that can be pretty important for some species, especially when they're moving, like during migration or post-breeding dispersal. If you're thinking about providing resources for birds in terms of foliage and structure, willows, alders, and the deciduous trees provide foliage and lots of insects. Again, like Anthony was saying this morning, the willow and the maple have lots of pollen and therefore lots of pollinators. They also have a lot of insects and other insects, and I know that they're great spots for birds. So I see a lot of birds associated with willows in particular, and some specialists like yellow warbler. if you have a nice willow patch, you're going to have yellow warblers. And then, so those are things that will be functional substitutes for ash. For cavity nesters, conifers are great for cavities. But then you have things that offer both foliage and cavities, and those would be your alder, aspen, cottonwood, and oak. And frankly, I was horrified this morning when Wyatt was talking about the Mediterranean oak borer, because if we were to lose our oak, that would be a huge deal. There are a lot of oak specialists, and in terms of insects and wildlife. So that was kind of alarming to me, much more so than ash. Sorry to say ash. In terms of functionality, these species would fulfill the role of ash for many wildlife species. My main message is diversity. Think about diversity. We need to maintain diversity of tree species, and that will maintain a diversity of our wildlife species. I also wanted to say that studies from back east, where they've gone through this, the ash borer, have found that woodpecker populations are doing great, and they, of course, eat the ash borer larvae, which is great, but woodpeckers, they can dampen populations, but they won't ever eliminate them. So they can make a little dent, they can kind of keep them from getting outrageous. Well, no, they're outrageous. Nothing can stop that. But what I wanted to say is that these species depend on insects, insects, really. Not the outbreak. They'll feed on the outbreak pests, but they need the bread and butter species insects that occur on all the other deciduous trees to maintain their populations. And then they can respond when there's an outbreak. But it's important to think big scale and long term, as my other panelists were saying. We really want to keep these species in the mix, and so we need to be thinking about providing habitat for them. And for example, a tree ash tree that you want to save with pesticide, the systemic pesticide is going to kill all the insects on the tree, and you'll save that tree, but it won't be functional for any for the insectivores. Something to think about. And I'm not saying we shouldn't save certain trees. I think the use of pesticides should be really strategic, and I think like we've said, it would be really hard to remove all the ash anyway, so we can hold out hope that some of those ash out there have the key to resistance to this pest.
Well, I would look at two things. One is connectivity and complexity. So connectivity to other areas that provide the wildlife benefit and the water quality benefit, but also the rarity and the conservation potential. So I would argue if you have an off-channel feature like a wetland that is ash dominated and is reference condition, it may be worth saving a portion of those trees with pesticide application on a rotation, just to keep the genetic diversity and that very important ecosystem intact. One thing to note, paying off of Joan's comment about insecticides, yes, they'll have a very negative effect on that particular tree and any insects that feed in it. But emamectin benzoate, if it's treated according to our more easterly colleagues, trees that are treated adjacent to other trees will provide protection for them. And so it's a 3-to-1 ratio where one tree is treated and 3 others around it are protected. So you could get into a setting where you go in and you treat 30% of a grove in an ash forested wetland. That provides a lot of protection for those other trees that then provide seed resources and genetic diversity for the future. The other thing to consider is that our ash are profligate and young when they breed. So they will breed and make at a younger age than East Coast or Midwestern black ash or green ash, for example. So our trees will come up, make some seed, and then maybe die from emerald ash borer infestation, but the genetics will continue to go on. It may be that you have ash on the landscape that are untreated, but they're just kind of understory species. They're just popping up and living for a short while, and then they dive back down and they're replaced by other youngins.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, but I would argue that there's conservation potential, and then there's that connectivity. And it may not be something you can replace.
Out of the people in this room, we might have 10 or 15 different goals. And so someone may be very focused on shade and shade credits. Someone may be very focused on wildlife. Someone may be very focused on recreational opportunities. And that diversity of goals is going to help us potentially manage differently in ways that are hopefully good overall, but also will lead to some conflicts and some problems, I'd say.
So I'm mostly focused on riparian forest areas, and I would be focused on those medium and small streams. And I think that especially on the medium sized streams that have kind of a mesic site conditions next to the river, there's lots of options. So like a lot of bad stuff is getting ready to happen, and I can only control so much of it. And so I'm kind of looking at like what is feasible. And even if I go after what's feasible, it's still a big challenge. So I'm definitely focused on like places where other species could be introduced, and also trying to, on the smaller streams, if those other, say I can't bring in Oregon oak to a highly connected groundwater situation. It's the water staying on the site, and there's water on the site right now. I would be thinking about invasive species management, which is going to be a big part of, transitioning all of these stands, but especially like re-canary grass, and then replanting with probably a lot of shrubs and shrub habitats in those areas. So I'm focused on small and medium-sized streams, and to translate that into something that's maybe more visible is like, I'm not thinking too much about from a shade perspective, which I think is something like that's justifiable to wrap my head around. I wouldn't be thinking about even like the main stem of the Tualatin, the bottom ends of it, or the Willamette River. You're not really getting a lot, I don't think, of super functional or critical shade there compared to some of the feeder tributaries. And then I'm cutting off my area of interest once I start to see the bottom of a stream, and Oregon ash's importance to maintaining riparian function dissipates. So once you get into like that, salmon spawning area is kind of when I would maybe like tone down my level of alarm a little bit and focus it really heavily on the floor of the Willamette Valley. There are safety risks to leaving like large ash stands and having, I'm doing most of it with contracted crews. And I mean, when I used to work as a contractor, we would not go out to the Sandy River Delta if, the winds are going to be up. You wouldn't be out on the Columbia, and it's going to be a similar type of situation in a lot of places. And I mean, there is also risk in a lot of these urban areas. I work next to farms, and there's rural power lines and stuff like this. So there is, I guess, urban forestry types of risk out in the rural areas too. Even if the ash borer isn't here, if you've got one next to a house or next to a power line, like I would go ahead and think about removing that on a calm day, Go ahead, Rob.
And I was going to argue also that, honestly, a lot of our riparian areas are depauperate of snags. And snags are a critical resource for a lot of species, as particularly our cavity nesters, which are going to be in there predating emerald ash borer larvae. So we might want to also consider places where we don't need to worry about the hazard and we can leave the snags to do their natural thing. Also, quite honestly, recruitment of wood into streams is one of the things that we do a lot of. We put a lot of wood into creeks and rivers as a replacement for all the wood we yarded out of them 150 years ago. So it's really also there is a slight upside to this, or some upside to it, which is more recruitment of large woody debris, and there will be more snags available to wildlife. So we have to consider there are some reasons not to yard all that stuff out of there and worry about burning it or chipping it or whatever.
Yeah, I think there were two parts to that question in my mind. One was about hazard trees, and that's obviously very complex, and I think we covered that pretty well. And the other was more or less timing of planting, right? Of advantages and disadvantages of waiting until emerald ash borer has moved through the area versus starting now versus, removing a lot of the hazard trees to be able to get contractors into plant and things like that. We've obviously glossed over all of the sort of risk in natural areas that edge up on urban areas of all sorts of different things, because we're trying to focus on planting here. I think we could talk for hours and hours about risk assessments and doing different things and getting logs on the ground and then letting the emerald ash borer emerge from it versus burying it or burning it or doing something else with it. I'm not sure we have a real great answer to any of that at the moment. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I think a lot about like the monotypic ash stands, that a lot of them, what I'm working in, are stuff that was planted, but then there's also the stuff that's out there. I be honest, I have already released some other species from young ash competition because I planted them 10 years ago and I didn't want them to get outcompeted before emerald ash borer got there. I think that has to do with the proximity that you are to where the outbreak is right now. So that's like definitely not like a one size fits all prescription. And then, there's talk about, creating gaps to plant into that might involve something, opening some areas up. But it generally seems like there's going to be opportunistic underplanting without a lot of management. And usually we use bare root stock, but there might need to be some larger stock that could be used in some of these cases to get through all of the native and non-native understory that's kind of developed there. And there's also advantages to having shade to plant into. I don't know when the last time it's rained, but I don't irrigate any of my plantings, and I've had really good success the past few years when there's like mixed shade that I'm planting into, like looking at how that species did in full sun and like shrinking clay versus like how it did in a relatively intact forest with some side light and everything.
The good news is in the East and in the Midwest, there's been a very concerted effort to identify resistant trees. Some species are more resistant, black versus green, for example, with black being more successful. Correct me, Wyatt?
Blue is the one that's more successful.
Blue is the one more successful. Thank you, Ryan. But the fact is that all of our Oregon ash are going to play lottery with this too. And I want to make an argument. I want to make a really deliberate argument that we shouldn't stop supporting ash on the landscape, even if it's just self-recruited ash. But maybe we even plant it, because imagine a sapling now is not going to be very attractive to an emerald ash borer, but a 10-year-old tree or a 50-year-old tree is very attractive. So imagine if you continued to plant through those 10 years while the organism is blowing its way through the Willamette Valley, you may have some of those ash that A, have resistance, or B, just simply outlast the initial attack of the organism and the big population explosion that's going to occur, and then will die back. And especially given the time for the biocontrols to take effect and for other types of environmental factors to take effect. So don't just give up on the ash. I had a slide. It said, don't stop believing. Sorry, I can't not quote Journey, but don't stop believing, don't stop planting, or don't stop supporting the ash, because there is somebody out there that will have those genes, and we have to have a little bit more faith in our colleagues that know a lot more about evolutionary processes in plants than we do.
We got time for one more.
Can I just add on to that real quick? I will say I would not support planting right at the moment. We're welcome to have different opinions here, right? But I would fund some research and keep an eye out for who is finding some success and being ready for that when it is there. Does that sound like a fair alternative?
Yeah, we can argue it.
Yeah.